in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm really excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Natasha Miller Williams. She is the head of diversity and inclusion at Ferrara USA. Natasha, thank you for being here. If you could share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Okay. Thank you for asking and thank you for inviting me. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I love the question, what did I want to be when I was a kid? I'll start by saying that early in life, I just wanted to be an entrepreneur. I was the child that had lots of businesses. I started like a thrift store on the family front porch, just selling my parents their own items back. I never had any customers but my parents. And so I was always opening some business or doing something like that. But as I got a little bit older, I learned about marketing research when I was in high school. We had a consumer behavior class, and I just really got all into it. You're probably more than the rest of the class, and the teacher loved it. And it was from there that I decided that I really wanted to get into marketing research. And so when I went to college, I selected marketing as a major and took all of the classes that were for someone who would want to specialize in marketing research. So it was some psychology classes and other things around buying behavior and consumer preferences. And that led me to my very first job, which was being a marketing research analyst.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. I love the entrepreneurial spirit from a young age as well, and selling your parents back things that they already had. Fast forward to now, when you think about your personal journey and kind of leading you to specifically Ferrara USA and being the head of diversity and inclusion, how do you think that really kind of led you on this path?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, just the turns of life and the experiences that you have, and now in my fourth decade of life, to be able to look back and see how it all came together. But as I mentioned, I started my career as a marketing research analyst. That title is sometimes called like a consumer insight specialist, or there are different names for it. But basically, the main responsibility of that job is to understand, people, consumers, and the decisions that they're making and their needs. And I was doing that work for about 10 years. My client was Kraft Foods here in Chicago. And I got into DEI through volunteerism. I was just that person wearing a second hat, getting involved in employee resource groups, or being involved through company recruitment efforts, whether that was going to HBCUs or other universities, or just giving my input to leaders in the organization on ways that the company could have a more inclusive culture. And along the way, I was building skill and just reinforcing my passion for the work. And so when the first opportunity became available to formally be involved in DEI, I really jumped into it because I not only had the passion, but I had the skill. And so now, as someone that has been in DEI and HR and employee engagement for about 8 years, I look back at that work of consumer insights, where I started my career, and DEI. And DEI is also about understanding people and what they need. I spend a lot of my time listening to our employees and making sure that we are building a strategy that translates to what people have articulated as their needs. So there really is that common thread that ties back to where I started my career.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a natural trajectory from your passion to your experience, and then the psychology behind people as well. And for this specific role, I think you started in the fall, in November 2020, before the pandemic, and you were helping build out the first of its kind initiatives at Ferrara USA. Could you talk about where you started with this work and kind of the employee participation you were seeing as well?
Yeah, well, you'll probably hear me say this word a lot, but it's true. The word is listen. We really started with listening to people. And so before I joined the organization, I joined in November of 2019, but my role was actually created because the company was listening to people. There was an employee engagement survey that had been fielded earlier that year in the spring. So the engagement survey results indicated that our employees saw the opportunity for the company to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the outcomes of that was the creation of my role and this department. And so I joined in November of 2019. And then I also started with just listening more. And so we had a listening tour where we were listening to people up and down the organization around their experience, their suggestions. And when we launched our strategic priorities for diversity, equity, and inclusion, people could see sometimes verbatim what they said built into that strategic plan, because we wanted our employees, individual contributors, managers, and leaders to know that we had taken the time to integrate their feedback into something that is so important to all of us.
Employee listening is something that we really believe is important, especially to create a psychologically safe workplace. And it's not only cultivating that feedback, but also what you said, actioning on it, using their words, seeing that you see employees and you're hearing what they're saying as well. Can you share how Ferrara USA is thinking about kind of fighting systemic racism, and maybe an example of a change in a process or initiative as well? I think in our pre-call, we also talked about the DEI Council and kind of the role that it played there too.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was actually going to go right to the launch of the council and some of
Yeah.
the initiatives of the council. And so following the events of 2020, we accelerated the launch of our first Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, which in 2020 included 45 employees, a representative group across our functions, across tenure, across level in the organization. It also included our CEO and his entire executive team. And that council was really charged with, one, making sure that the DEI strategy is aligned to our business strategy, but also executing against 6 strategic areas. And without getting into too much detail, the council focused on cultural competence and inclusion. So making sure that we were really building that muscle within the organization to tackle important topics such as bias, microaggressions, privilege. And so that group led initiatives, conversations, and topics like that. The council also had a pillar that focused on metrics and reporting. And so that team led the work around publishing our very first workforce study and being really transparent with our data internally and externally. So it's actually on our corporate website right now, ferrarausa.com. We had a pillar that focused on our production facilities. And so the majority of our workforce is in our plants, and they are thinking thoughtfully about how we integrate our frontline workers into our strategy. We had a pillar that focused on supplier diversity and how we are working with minority and women-owned businesses. We had a pillar that is thinking about philanthropy and how we direct dollars as well as in-kind giving to organizations. And so we allocated $150,000 to organizations, both local and national, that are aligned with our values, as well as our objective to eliminate systemic racism and oppression of all forms. And then the last pillar was community engagement. And that group prioritized education. And that's where we've really made an impact in ensuring that we are investing in education initiatives that can serve underserved communities. And so we have some great relationships, including one with an organization named Lumity here in Chicago, where we are helping youth in high schools that have needs, and our volunteers are supporting that organization and their objectives. And so that was one of the areas where, through those 6 pillars, our council has really supported the initiatives and the elimination of systemic racism, oppression, and advancing our DEI initiatives.
I love that. I feel like the pillars really kind of take a holistic lens to inclusion as well, internal for employees, but also external too, right? Because the company and the folks who are on the council and just the employees in general can have such a huge impact on the local community and just at the world at large. And you mentioned kind of flexing the muscle and having kind of conversations around bias and being vulnerable and microaggressions. And a big part of that too is having empathy as well. In one of your LinkedIn posts, you focused on the importance of thriving companies really practicing empathy intentionally. How do you promote kind of meaningful and hard conversations at Ferrara, for example, around race and social justice?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying that empathy is so important to us as an organization that we added it as a value. And so in May, we added a fifth company value that we are empathetic. It is both a practice and the ambition to make sure that every employee is really thinking about how we can, again, take the time to listen to each other, to better understand each other, and to practice that not only in our one-to-one interactions, but in the way that we work. So that's the first thing. But when it comes to those meaningful conversations about difficult topics, that was so important in 2020. I mean, you just couldn't not talk about these things. Like there was no way to separate work from home when we were like sitting here. I mean, I'm sitting here at home right now.
Yeah.
And so there was no way to separate the two. And so we had a few things that we did. We scheduled conversations for our employees to actually talk about topics like as a department. So some of our functional leads leveraged an inclusive conversation guide that we created, just encouraging leaders that to just start where you are. You don't have to be an expert to have a conversation with your team about a topic, about a current event. You know, we have ground rules. We leveraged a ground rule from our friends at Walmart. Their ground rule is to allow for a first draft, which basically means that you're not gonna say everything right the first time, which I think is the barrier that a lot of people have, that they're worried about saying the wrong thing. And so we, shamelessly stole that ground rule and just reminded our employees to just get started, give grace. And our department leads facilitated conversations. And then secondly, we created a space called Processing Spaces, where we invited a licensed race and wellness therapist to facilitate conversations that were opt-in for our employees to come and talk about topics. And so we scheduled them throughout the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. And they were so well attended as just a healing environment, a learning environment, and a connecting environment for people to build that muscle of empathy and just hearing each other out.
I love that. I think that's so important also to set up a specific space to talk about these things. And in terms of a first draft as well, everybody is at a different part of their kind of learning journey. And part of having hard conversation is doing the internal work, being self-aware. And, to have that, you need to lead with vulnerability. And like you said, you don't know everything, but you have to kind of be open to learning and also just having a conversation with folks. You mentioned therapy. I love therapy. I think it's a very important resource that if you're able to kind of have in your life, you should definitely do it. And you've provided, therapy as a resource to Ferrara USA employees. Why was this really important to your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy?
Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying that vulnerability matters. And I know that we all do our best to put our best foot forward at work. And over the past year and a half, following the events of 2020, following the pandemic, what mattered most to us was just to acknowledge the entire person and what we were all experiencing. And that meant vulnerability. And that meant even leaders role modeling that same sense of vulnerability. And it, as an organization that was newly prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion, without creating vulnerable spaces, I don't believe that we would have made the progress that we made in the past year and a half without doing so.
Hmm. I definitely think that is important. And also, just again, creating the very intentional space with resources, with time, and just meeting employees where they are. I think that's really important. I'm sure there never goes a day where you are bored and there's so much going on in your role and at the company. But what is kind of the next problem or situation you're currently trying to solve? What is taking up the most brain space right now?
Yeah, there's so many things that I think we can talk about both internally within our organization, as well as the opportunities that are in our backyard and in our community. But I'll start by talking about internally, and it's organizational culture, because companies are going to feel different, as we continue in this pandemic, and the importance of having a proper culture as we continue in the pandemic, or as organizations discuss return to office, wherever an organization may be on that spectrum. We've been talking about our organizational culture and the importance of making sure that the efficacy of our strategy isn't held back because we don't have a shared proper culture. And so we have a working team. In fact, we are evolving that council that I talked about and adding a pillar that's focused on culture, so that we have a group of thoughtful leaders that are thinking about organizational culture. And it builds upon that fifth value that we added, and just making sure that we are living those values, that we are educating our employees on how to live those values every day. Because if you think about it, sometimes values can live on a wall. Like, you can walk into an organization and you'll walk down the hallway, or you'll see some poster that will highlight what the company's values are. But either one, not every person will even know what the values are if you were to do a pop quiz. Not that you would, but if you were, not
Yeah.
everyone would know what those values are. Or two, if you were to really observe if they are being role modeled from the top down, it's not always being role modeled. So we're really taking ownership of that to say, how do we live our values at Ferrara? So that's where we're headed next as an organization internally. Externally, there's just a lot to do in our community. Like, as we think about the opportunities to close the gaps that exist in terms of economic divides, and in terms of the ongoing issues of systemic inequities that exist. And so we want to continue to build on our community and philanthropic efforts to find the right partners that we can support to do so.
Hmm. Again, I really like that kind of internal looking at your employees. And I really believe that the workplace is a microcosm of society, and then looking outward to the community to see, okay, what can we do to really support and be an active member as well. I know we've been talking a lot about Ferrara USA strategy, kind of your personal experience. I would love to ask, as well, as folks are continuing to evolve their own diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, knowing that every company, every leader is different, what are some of the common mistakes you've seen kind of out into the universe when folks are trying to, create a really impactful DEI strategy?
Well, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'm going to go back to what I said, which is not taking the time to listen and building a strategy in a vacuum. Because you can go to Google right now and, like, 5 steps to build a DEI strategy, and you can do that, and you can march into any organization and you'll find some pretty, like, common things. It'll say, workforce data and employee resource groups. It might say a council. It might identify things that you and I have talked about. But if you don't understand the nuances of that organization by taking the time to listen to the team, that's a mistake, to me. I think the second thing, which is a group that is so important and often overlooked and not talked about enough, is just your people managers. And so we
Yeah.
spend a lot of time talking about senior leadership, and make no mistake about it, senior leaders are so important, because everything can run empty without their support, and your frontline employees make a difference. You can get a huge groundswell from everyone's enthusiasm and commitment, but many decisions happen right at that manager level. Managers are hiring, making performance decisions on who's promoted, who's moving about, and often, that group, like right in the middle of the organization, is left behind or neglected as you are building these big plans that address the top and the front line of the organization. And so that's another watch out that I would, point out as someone is getting started on the journey, is just thinking with intention about the middle of the organization at the same time.
Yeah, I think people leaders are huge culture champions. I know a lot of individual contributors, work more with their people manager than they do with the CEO or, a C-level executive as well. So they have a huge impact on the culture and carrying that through as well. What is a must-have that people managers need to incorporate in their strategy to be successful in the future of work, in your opinion?
I would give two. The first is data, to be a data-led organization, because, we talked a lot about passion and energy and enthusiasm, but we're also a data-led organization, solely through our passion and enthusiasm. We're also using data to guide our decisions. And so that was at the start of our journey as well, is to see what does the data say, whether that's coming from the employee engagement or from our workforce data or from other sources. And then I think the second, specifically from like a leader perspective, is just curiosity. And I think that ties back into the data, because if you're curious, you can just figure out where to go next. Whether you're going somewhere next in your data and like double clicking or digging into something else with your data, or whether your curiosity is leading you into who to talk to next, or your curiosity is leading you into who to partner with next. But that sense of curiosity is important. And that's not just with DEI. I mean, that's with any area of business. And DEI isn't different from any other business function. We sometimes treat it differently, or we may talk about it in a different way, but it's just like any other business function in terms of the priorities that you set, the goals that you set, the level of accountability that should be established for people who are in my role, as well as for the rest of the organization.
I think that sense of curiosity too relates to innovation and not leaning on, this is the way things always have been done, so we have to do it this way. And really, again, listening to your employees, which is a common theme that we have been discussing here today. I do want to ask specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion roles. I would argue or just say that it might include more emotional labor than other roles. And I heard another one of your interviews that your passion for equity is a combination of lived and learned experiences. I've heard that from other kind of leaders as well. And I wanted to know, in your opinion, do you think that it's important for folks in these spaces in diversity, equity, and inclusion work to identify as part of a historically marginalized kind of group?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think it's important for anyone in the role to know how to listen to other people. While I consider myself to be a part of a marginalized group as a woman and as a woman of color, I can't identify with everyone. I only know my own lived experiences. And I also can't identify with every Black woman. I only know my own lived experiences. And so I guess my short answer is no. I believe that anyone can be successful in the role if they take the time to listen and surround themselves with a team of people who are willing to work together. Like, my ability to be successful in this role is through being surrounded by a team of people who can help work together to make the right decision. So I'm not making any decision by myself, even as a person who identifies as a member of an underrepresented group. I think that would be a disservice to the organization. And so for that reason, I would say that someone who is not a member of a marginalized group could be equally successful if they follow that same practice of listening and being really thoughtful. Now, that individual may experience, their own set of challenges by not being a member of a marginalized group. But I think we all experience our own set of challenges in the role that we're in. Like I experience my set of challenges when I walk in a room as and only. And so that person may have their own set of challenges, but I think that they could be overcome in the ways that I just described.
Absolutely. Having the kind of openness, vulnerability, empathy, and also just intentional listening is really important in these kind of roles. Is there, I'm sure you have many of these, but are there, whether it's day to day or finishing a project, a moment of flow or a proudest kind of moment throughout your career where you're like, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be at this moment, or I'm very happy with this result?
One of, I'm going to answer this, and I hope I'm answering in the way that you're asking the question, but one of my passions, just in broader DEI, inclusion, belonging, is around mentoring. I have a lot of passion for mentoring. And so when I see someone who I have been close to in a mentoring relationship have their own wins, like that's so, I have so much joy in that. Whether it came from like one conversation or just the brief interaction or way that I may have been able to play a small part in their journey, I would say that I get just a lot of joy in mentoring and seeing the successes that come in from someone else's career or business wins that have been a part of a mentoring relationship, whether it was my own, or even if someone else comes and tells me that something happened from their own mentoring relationship. That is so exciting to me because it just comes back to that connection that, one person, the impact that one person can have on somebody else's life is really powerful.
I think that's a great answer. Absolutely. I think the value of mentors in your life, your personal board of directors, your sponsors, the folks that really kind of help you along the way. Nobody's working in a silo is really important. Natasha, is there anything that I either didn't ask you that you want to kind of share, or maybe 1 to 2 key takeaways you hope the folks who are listening bring with them after kind of listening to our conversation today?
Yeah, well, actually, I will share it by building upon what we were just talking about in terms of the value that one person can have in a way that, could have, if it didn't happen, like someone could be in a completely different position. And so I'll kind of go all the way back to where we started. When I was in college, I didn't really have a mentor in college. I don't know how many college students have mentors. I certainly didn't have one. And my college professor who was teaching the marketing research class obviously saw some potential in me, which I appreciate because though I knew my desired career path, I just wasn't taking a lot of proactive steps towards actually getting a job. So much so that I did not even attend the career fairs that the school was offering. And so she approached me and said that a company was coming, the company that I first started at, Nielsen, had come to the career fair and that I should interview with them. And I'm like, oh, well, I missed the career fair. I didn't, even think to go, too bad for me. And she wrote a letter for Nielsen to interview me. And it just kind of like cut me in line to interview with Nielsen. And of all of the students that they came to meet through the career fair and everything, I'm the only person that got hired from that university as a result of this professor
Wow.
writing the letter. And I obviously went on to work at Nielsen for 20 years, starting in
Yeah.
that first role and leading into my DEI experience. And it's because one person saw something in me to just go out of her way just a little bit to help me to just, get on a path, because I hadn't taken the step myself. And it's experiences like that that benefited me, that really motivate me to see what I can do for someone else in my career. And so that's what motivates me. And I think we can like take that spirit and that energy into the workplace and just think about how we can extend ourselves just a little bit or a lot to help someone else on their journey, because it can really make the difference. And that act of kindness made the difference in my entire career, because I honestly don't know where I would have started my career path if it wasn't for that.
That's incredible. I didn't know that story behind it, but I did know that you were at Nielsen for, around 20 years. So that's a huge impact on your career and just someone kind of helping you along kind of the way as well and seeing you and the kind of mentorship piece. I love that. Natasha, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we believe in the power of employee feedback management, and we know it's a requirement for the company to succeed. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.